Seated before you is the three of the founding members of the IANDS organization 30 years ago. Their collective wisdom and insight got us to where we are today. Bruce, if you didn't hear that, Bruce just apologized. What we're going to do is, I've got a couple of questions for the panelists, and they're going to take 10 minutes or so each to answer that question. And then, as time allows, we'll see how that goes, and then we will end at 4:30, plus or minus. This is 4:30. Try 5:30. Okay, senior moment number 4. Yeah. Okay, so Raymond doesn't like my first question. So this might be like the politicians. You ask them a question and they answer something totally different. And you're left to feel like Karnak, with the envelope. What's the question they're really answering? Raymond, you get to start, complete with cookie. What's the single most important thing that sticks with you from the last 30 years of NDE exploration?
Oh, man. That's a big one. I don't know. To apologize, to one of you have a ready thing on your mind? Because I'm going to have to think about this. The most important thing. I am sorry that I'm at a loss for words.
That is not like you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think of something more recent. And I think that what's going on right now that I see very important, that I've kind of sensed in the last 5 years or so, is that it seems to me that the scoffers are on the defensive. And by that I mean, and I have to say scoffers because of this, I think it's very important to realize what the skeptical philosophy is really all about. And what that's all about is a guy named Pyrrho. Pyrrho was the founder of the skeptical movement. And he came along in the Hellenistic period of philosophy after Alexander the Great had gone down into Egypt and conquered the world, essentially. And this was after Aristotle. And after Aristotle codified logic, Pyrrho started the skeptical movement, and if you think about it this way, what Aristotle taught us was a systematic procedure for drawing a conclusion, right? And so only in that context could the skeptics arise, because Pyrrho's thought was, well, what if we don't draw the conclusion? And they even had manuals to tell you how to do this. Don't draw the conclusion that there's a table in front of you. It might be a cardboard cutout or a holographic projection, and so on and so on and so on. But it wasn't just being abrasive that caused them to adopt this. It was that what they found is that if you assiduously follow that procedure, as anybody who's ever done it can tell you, two things happen. Number one, you really do have a kind of experience of consciousness expansion. What these early schools of philosophy were all about, really, it was impossible for them. They couldn't have even conceived separation of the spiritual quest from the intellectual quest. That's a modern development. And so the skeptical procedure or process was so that they would have this mind-expanding experience, which you have to sort of do it to experience, but you will experience it. But secondly, also, they realize that if you try to think of it geometrically and everybody else is running in this direction to get to the conclusion, but your procedure is to withhold a conclusion, then that what that does, metaphorically, is that it opens up your peripheral vision, and you see side pathways of inquiry that everybody else missed because they're running in this direction to get to the conclusion. So that's what a skeptic is all about. That's what the skeptical movement is. Now, run that through the people you hear in the modern world who say, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain or whatever. Or I'm a skeptic about apparitions of the deceased. I think it's just wishful thinking. Well, now, knowing what you do about being a skeptic, unpack that remark, and it translates into, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. That's not being a skeptic. But this wonderful early philosophy has been railroaded and taken over by this modern group of people who are basically practitioners of scientism, and many times who are entertainers. If you look at the skeptical movement, so-called, it's full of these magicians and so on, or maybe very interesting people, but they're not really scholars. They may be scholars of magic or whatever. But, you know, in the last 5 years, I've sensed that the scoffers, to distinguish them from skeptics, the scoffers, the people who are in this what was formerly called the psychiatrist movement, I just detect, I think I'm pretty good at sort of spotting trends and feeling where things are going. It seems to me that movement is definitely on the defensive now. They've been rattled. When I see them in debates and so on, there's not this abrasive aggressiveness that you used to see, but it's rather kind of like more like they feel like they don't know where they are, and all their old arguments have run out and proved invalid, and still this thing keeps rising. So I would say that is maybe I think there's been a turnaround where the scoffers are now, they are on the defensive, rather than people who are proposing that, look at this. I saw Sanjay Gupta of CNN on TV a few months ago talking about this with an alleged skeptic, who's nothing to do with being a skeptic, but the guy they had to represent. He was definitely intimidated by these physicians who were standing there saying, holy mackerel, what is this? And, you know, and they were the experts on neurophysiology, so the pseudo-skeptic couldn't really come back. So I think that's probably what, just confronted with this question immediately, that's what comes to mind, that I think that we've seen a turnaround where it's now the ball is in their court to come up with something.
Pass the mic down.
You had 2 questions for him?
No, just
Okay.
same one for you, Bruce.
Okay.
He wants to repeat the question.
That's my deaf ear. What's the single most important thing that sticks with you from the last 30 years of NDE exploration?
I'm just joking.
You have to remember that I came at this from the perspective of a clinical psychiatrist. And here Raymond came up in 1975 with this bizarre experience people have, which is as different from our normal reality as most schizophrenic hallucinations are.
I would say far more.
So, from the perspective as a psychiatrist, what sticks with me most over the past 30 years is the accumulating evidence that these are not only not mental illness, but contribute to mental health. Wait. I've only got 10 minutes here. In the first place, these things happen to perfectly normal people in abnormal situations. These people are people who have normal lives, they hold down jobs, they have relationships, they don't have any of the common problems that people with mental illness have. Furthermore, these experiences end up enriching people's lives. They make you feel more connected to the world around you, more connected to a sense of meaning and purpose in life, and more, what's the opposite of fearful? Well, it makes you less fearful. How about that? It makes you less fearful about engaging in life. And most hallucinations and delusions do just the opposite. They make you withdraw from others, feel isolated, feel frightened of everything in life, and they diminish your life in general. So they're unlike near-death experiences in the way they happen to people and to the way they affect people. Furthermore, I've seen now that people after decades still remember the NDE as vividly as if it happened yesterday. And if you ask a schizophrenic about a hallucination he had 30 years ago, he's not going to be able to tell it to you. Can you remember a dream you had 30 years ago? Now, one aspect of these things not being related to mental illness, and they really are not related, one aspect is that they aren't signs of mental illness. The other aspect is they're not signs of mental health either. Being a psychiatrist, I talk to a lot of people who have serious mental illness. And the question then comes up, what happens to them when they have a near-death experience? And they have the same types of after effects that people who aren't mentally ill have, which means that when they are not in the throes of their mental illness, they feel less fearful and they feel more enriched and more in touch with other people. However, if they have a biological illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, when the illness kicks in, the NDE is no protection against that. And when I first got involved in this and was enraptured with the benefits of NDEs, I was kind of shocked when I saw people still having schizophrenic breaks and manic episodes after their NDEs. Now, I will say, though, that people who have more situational mental illnesses, like depression and anxiety, often do get better with a near-death experience. If the reason you're feeling depressed is that you feel alone and isolated and have no sense of meaning in your life, those things get better. And in fact, people who are suicidal and then have near-death experiences often become less suicidal afterwards. Now, you've heard about people who are not, and that's certainly true. Nothing here is 100%. And I've known near-death experiencers who were still suicidal after the NDE, particularly if they come back to a life that's full of problems. But for the most part, the NDE gives people a sense of meaning and purpose in the context of which their problems take on a different perspective. They still have the same problems that made them suicidal, but now they see them differently. They're challenges. They're opportunities for growth rather than reasons to escape. So I see this as something that's critically important for me as a psychiatrist, to be able to differentiate bizarre experiences that are helpful from those that are harmful. And more importantly for me as a professor in the medical school is to pass this on to the next generation. That's it. Can you repeat the question for John?
No, I was wondering if I could answer the second question first. And sweet. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you all. Good to see everybody, some old friends and many new ones. I want to congratulate you all for having the wisdom and insight and courage to be a part of this meeting, to come to this meeting. In my mind, you're part of the solution. And God knows the world needs more people who are part of the solution. And it begins in this room. I know that it's not limited to this room, but the folks here are a big part of that solution. So to answer the question, well, for me, it's more than 30 years. I go back with Raymond to 74, so it's like, what is that, 37 years, something like that? Anyway, the greatest contribution over the last 30 years that I can call to mind is, for me, is the people that I had the great privilege of meeting, going back to 1974, when I had the great privilege to meet Raymond when he was a medical student, still working on Life After Life, which wasn't published until November 1975. Many, many, many wonderful people, researchers and experiencers who contributed to my life in innumerable ways. One of them you know well, and I would be remiss if I didn't give you his love, his best wishes, and his greetings from Kentfield, California, the illustrious Dr. Kenneth Ring. I was just with him a few weeks ago. He's alive and well, still in his body, still in good health, still chasing women, although at the moment he's with one who he is very enamored of, and he thinks he's going to go the distance with this one, Harry Schwartz. And he wants to be here personally, but he won't get on a plane. He just hates to travel. So I had his permission to give you his love and blessings and good wishes.
Is it true that he's working on a book called Life After Life?
Bruce just asked if his next book is coming out soon, called Wife After Wife. Well, I'm not at liberty to disclose that. But our dear Ken is still reading and writing. He's as beautiful as he ever was, and with us all very much. He's really not divorced from this field. There's no bad feeling of any sort. He wishes us well, and if IANDS ever has a meeting out in the Mill Valley area, you probably would persuade him to come and sing Back in the Saddle again. Anyway, the people I have met have contributed to my life in ways that I can't even possibly begin to tell you, beginning with Raymond Moody. When I met Raymond, through a series of incredible coincidences or synchronicities that he believes were transcendent in nature, and I believe that too. I think it was all the product of cosmic choreography. From that day forward, my life changed forever. And I never had a near-death experience. I've never been out of my body that I know of. I've been out of my mind a few times, but never out of my body. And I met somebody, speaking of the people that I've met over the years, I met somebody at the very beginning of this conference. I'm going to put him on the spot. He's right there. Fritz Klein. Fritz, can you stand for a second just so that people know who I'm talking about? Fritz is a retired biomedical engineer. Give him a hand, if you would. He's just like I was, like in 1974. I came to this field an agnostic. I had been raised Catholic, but I gave it up for Lent. And I had I tried various religions, but none of them really spoke to me, and I didn't feel that any of them were speaking truth. There were elements of truth, but a lot of spin. So I sort of decided to become an agnostic because I didn't really have the answers until I met people like George Ritchie and Vi Horton and Aubrey Matthews and some other folks that Raymond introduced me to that were the subject of Life After Life. And it was from their stories, and not just their stories, but I ended up, because of Raymond's inspiration, taking an interest in the historical aspects of NDEs and going back to the time of Plato and even before to discover accounts that very much parallel what we know about the contemporary near-death experience. And I said, there must be something to this, you know, and I started looking into other things, including general out-of-body experiences, past life recall, read Ian Stevenson's book back then, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. Bruce was Ian's protege, for those of you who don't know, and now holds the seat at UVA that once was held by Ian. And, of course, just general peak experiences, transpersonal, transcendental experiences that were brought on by one way or another. And yet they all seem to have the same recurring motif, and this inspired me to develop a cosmology that, at the age of 22, that is still with me today at the age of 59. And one of the people I met back then in the early days was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote the foreword to Life After Life. And she never equivocated, you know, about the meaning and purpose of life or the meaning and purpose of the NDE. She was convinced that they were evidential of survival and that we should recognize that and get on with the business of, you know, trying to figure out what that meant for human existence. So I have been very privileged to be influenced by these people. And Fritz was saying to me, and one reason I introduced him is, I said, well, you know, what brings you here? He said, well, it's my first IANDS meeting. So he's a first-time visitor. And he said, I had to come here because when I read Raymond's book all those years ago, I think I asked him if he was an experiencer. He said, no, I've never had an experience. But I'm very interested in the topic. I've got, I think he said, 14 books. I began with Raymond's book. And when I read about the NDE, well, for me, that was a game changer. And I could relate to that because it was a game changer for me. And so as it changed the game for me, I assumed it could change the game for everybody else too. Why not? Maybe it could be the antidote to what ails the human race. Maybe it could be a catalyst to get us from where we are to where we ought to be, which is basically heaven on earth. I mean, there's no reason we can't have that. To me, is what the way my mind works. I saw it as a way to bring an end to hunger, poverty, war, just stupidity in general. Okay, I mean, I saw it as a way to remedy all the self-inflicted problems that we have managed to create for ourselves. Now, the NDEers that I met back in those days, they said, you know, they had a sense of urgency about all this. Many of them did, not all of them, but many of them did. They said, you know, we got to get the word out. We got to tell people about this experience. They had no confusion over what the experience meant. It was a game changer for them too. They didn't equivocate about whether it was evidence of survival. They were convinced that it was for them personally. And since science wasn't able to come up with a better explanation, I figured we ought to take them at face value. And what harm could it do? And it might just make religion obsolete, because really, you know, God has no religion. He has no affiliation. And I don't confuse God and religion. I mean, for me, religion is sort of like big business anymore, and it's done some good. I don't quarrel with that, but it's done a lot of harm too. And it's divisive. And I'm not, you know, in favor of anything that's divisive. I'm in favor of what brings people together. The NDE unifies, because no matter what religious background somebody has, they all seem to report the same kind of symbology. And I thought, wow, you know, Jews and Christians and Muslims all basically having the same, you know, peak experience. This is hopeful. This can be unifying. This is what we need. So for me, the NDE presented a solution. And I salute Bruce Greyson, Ken Ring, Mike Sabom, Raymond Moody, and so many others who joined with me in helping this association to become established and flourish over the years. And I compliment them on their courage and their pioneering spirit. It wasn't easy. I mean, back in '76, Raymond was getting letters and phone calls accusing him of being in league with the devil. So it's true. Every now and then his eyes turn red. I don't know what to make of that. But they have really made an enormous contribution to the evolution of human spirituality. But as I look around me and I see the indicators, we still have a long way to go. And the world is as troubled as it's ever been. So the work that the researchers have before them and that the experiencers have before them is more paramount now than it's ever been. And back in 74, 75, when I met my second near-death experiencer, they told me that, we got to get the word out about this because we can have a much better world. And if people understand that, we're eternal beings and that what we do to others, we do to ourselves, and that the meaning and purpose of life is to love one another. It's no more complicated than that. You don't need a profound theology. You don't need stacks of religious texts. All you need to know is you're eternal. We're here to love one another. And what you do to others, you do to yourself. We all come from the same source. We all return to the same source. That's what I took away from it. That's my belief system in total. And I figured if we could get that belief system in place through better and better research, through greater longitudinal studies, which still need to be done, and cross-cultural studies and standstill surgery studies, which are very important, I thought maybe more people could, catch on to this, and maybe we might get to that 100th monkey critical mass, and maybe it could change the nature of political, social, and economic systems. And maybe all this imbalance that we have could be ameliorated. Now, I could have been naive in thinking all that. I hope not, because the other thing the experiencers told me was, well, if we don't learn to love one another and live cooperatively, we won't have a sustainable future. And we might not have a future at all as a species. I currently study quantum physics. I have been for years with Edgar Mitchell. We have a foundation called Quantrek. And as I learn more about what goes on in the quantum realm, it just simply confirms and reaffirms what I've learned from all the wonderful people I've met, researchers and experiencers, over the last 35, 36 years. That at that level of observable reality, what nature teaches is cooperation, collaboration, harmony, and resonance. Without it, creation as we know it would not be possible. If, electrons decided to fight with protons, it just wouldn't work. Oh, you're a proton, I'm not going to have anything to do with you, I'm an electron. It wouldn't work. So at that level of reality, there is cooperation, cohesion, resonance, harmony. Now imagine what we could do as a species if we could get in that same space, if we could transcend ego, if we could grow into non-duality, a spiritual interpretation of reality. Well, I think all the problems that currently plague humanity would quickly dissipate. And we might just be able to get to nirvana here on earth. Don't have to die to get to heaven anymore.
Can I interrupt you there?
Yeah, well, she didn't flash me. I thought you were going to flash me. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I could go on.
Okay. Question number 2. What's the most interesting topic in the NDE arena that currently tickles your imagination?
Yeah, that one is much easier. And because that's just personal, right? Like what tickles my imagination. And I definitely have something happen with that. And I should sort of put this into context in that, one of the great conceptual problems that I've been interested in for a long time, and especially since I was an undergraduate student, is the whole notion of what constitutes personal identity. And there have been a lot of theories about this and so on. I won't even bother to list that list of different theories of it, but one very interesting way of looking at it that I've thought about for a long time is that human beings, so far as we know, are the only creatures who have an inborn ability to frame an ongoing life narrative, right? As you inwardly, you tell your own life story, and you may divulge parts of it to your fellow human beings, or you may disguise parts of it or whatever, but you do nonetheless have that own continual life story. And again, I mean, this is vast, but there's a certain amount of background that really is leading me to sense that maybe the way all of this is arranged is that you get to go through everybody's narrative. That's, I know, very bizarre sounding, but in other words, we hold on to our personal identity very firmly. So maybe this sounds like a violation, but I'm beginning to suspect that the big story is something like this, that when you die, you can have trips through anybody else's life, that your consciousness can go through these structures that are made, which are lives, and that from this framework you flip into when you die. I could live the Bruce Greyson life with my consciousness and going through it sort of automatically. You could do the same, or anybody could. And that the way this thing is wired or put together in a larger sense involves that possibility. I really do sense that's true. Now, another thing here is, and this is maybe just a little bit out of the framework, but nonetheless, this is something that's been a very powerful impact on me in the past few years. And I would just sort of tell what happened. I should explain as background on this. My wife and I don't talk about life after death. We talk about how we're going to pay the phone bill, what movie we're going to take the kids, what's for dinner tonight, what's on TV, what we're going to do about my daughter's report card, I mean, that kind of thing. And we're not religious. We don't go to church. Now, we have 2 adopted kids, both adopted at birth. Carter is Mexican-American by heritage. We were there for his birth. My wife was the first person to hold him when the obstetrician delivered him. And then a couple of years later, our daughter Carol Ann, the same thing, adopted at birth, came along. And Carol Ann is a Blackfeet Indian. Okay, and very much so. It's that part of it has been very fascinating because, you know, theoretically you read about genetics and stuff, but to see this in your own family. Carol Ann, from the time of her birth, has always wrapped herself in a blanket, and she looks just like an Indian person walking around. Every morning when I wake up and she bounces into the room, I'm in that kind of halfway zone. I'm saying, my gosh, there's a little Indian over there. Oh, it's my daughter. And, you know, the Blackfeet women were gatherers for 20,000 years. Well, naturally, the ones who were good at that were the ones who survived, right? And she has that. I've pushed all of my kids in the stroller from a so I know this. I've got 3 older ones. But the boys, when they would get to a certain age where they were too big to fit into the stroller, they would just give it up. They wouldn't walk with me anymore. Whereas Carol Ann protested against the stroller at a very early age, and even when she was less than 3 years old, she wanted to get out of the stroller and walk with me. And beginning at literally the age of 3, a little over 3, she walks 6 miles with me without complaint and carries what she calls her nature bag. My wife, without even thinking of the Native American connotation, started calling Carol Ann Eagle Eyes because it is amazing. So like last spring, we were walking along and she just sat out of nowhere. We walked way out in the country and she said, I'm going to find some bird's eggs. And I said, well, okay. In less than a mile, she found 3 different species of bird's eggs. One plainly of robin's eggs, the other like a hen's egg, but white and was kind of small. Then another unknown kind of oval thing with blue with little red spots. And so I said, well, how do you do that? And she looked, and I could see her trying to say or trying to articulate. And finally she just said, oh, go over on the other side of the road and look. You know, she couldn't articulate it. And my sister, who's very intuitive, said, well, this child needs a teepee, and got her a teepee. And she was obviously, oh, wow, this is something I like. And for a while we were wondering, well, you know, is she just going to move out into her teepee? And so now, okay, these kids don't get any contact with the notion of an afterlife. This is my profession. At home, it's a different thing. Carter is now 13. When he was 5, he and I were watching TV, and I was flipping the channels with the remote control, and I flipped through what turned out to be the National Geographic Channel. And so when I did, Carter became very animated, and he said, Dad, Dad, Dad. He said, that's my village. And I said, what? And I flipped it back, and this was a documentary about village life in China. So Carter's chattering away. He said, yeah. He said, it's like I was in China. It's like my mama and dad before I came to you. It's like we were living in China. And I was saying, what? And he could tell that I was just... And so to clarify, he said, yeah. And he said, then I saw you and Mom lying in the grass. And I knew exactly what he was talking about before. 5 years plus before he was born. My wife and I were in Greece. And the attendant at this oracle told us, well, he could tell we were tired, so he said, just go and lie down over there in the grass at this oracle and rest. And so we were kind of napping, and we were talking about adopting a child. Now, flash forward to maybe about 1.5 years ago. We take these long walks, and about 1 mile from our house is this little wooden bridge. And Carol Ann likes to sit there and talk. So, 1.5 years ago, so she's talking to me, and out of nowhere she says, I don't like this place. And I said, what? And she said, yeah. And it was plain she was talking about the world. And so I was just astonished, and I was listening to her. And she said, yeah. She said, you know, when you die, you just go up and be with God. And she says, and He keeps you up there until all of the people you know while you're alive have died, and then He sends you back as another person. And I was amazed. And then she said, yeah, and she said, I was with God, and He pointed you out to me. And He said, you got to go down and be His daughter. And I said, well, how did you feel about that? And she said, I didn't want to do it. She said, I wanted to stay with my Goddie, as she said. And then I said, well, are you glad you came anyway? She said, oh, yeah. And she also said, I didn't want to do it, but God pushed me. Like pushing with her hand, she said. He pushed me down. Now, that's not directly related, I think, to near-death experiences, but it's something I wouldn't have been listening to unless I had this background where I'm over. So I think those things, the 2 things that have tickled my imagination most personally in the last few years with it.
I've always loved listening to your stories. I've never known what to make of them.
You should talk to Carol Ann and Carter. They're
I
still
should.
talking about
Yeah.
this. I mean,
Yeah.
and Cheryl was driving along with them in a car a few weeks ago, and they were talking about their reincarnationism. And so, yeah.
Is that a trap?
More. All right, there are three things about NDEs that are tickling my fancy right now. I'm going to tell you them in increasing order of importance to keep the suspense up. The least important one is what I talked about this morning, about the implications of NDEs for mind and brain being separate entities. I think this is actually a very, very important topic for the reasons I mentioned this morning. And the reason I say it is the least important now is because I have no idea what the solution to this problem is or how many generations it'll take us to get there. So I'm not putting it on the top of a list of things that really tickle me now because it's more like an itch than a tickle. I know it's important, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime. What we do know is that the current model is not satisfactory. I don't have something to replace it with yet. The second thing, which is more exciting for me, is to see the way the reception of NDEs in society has changed over the last 30 years. When we first started doing this, no one had heard about NDEs. They were in the literature, but they didn't have a name, so they weren't called that, and nobody had pulled them all together. Back in 1980, four of us did a panel at the American Medical Association conference about near-death experiences. And by this time, a few people heard the name because Raymond's book had been out for 5 years, but most health professionals didn't. And we had a fairly large audience there, and four of us were presenting. And the last one was Mike Sabom, who was a cardiologist, who was presenting the most scientifically respectable study of the four of us, and presenting from a hard cardiology perspective. And when it was over, somebody raised his hand to speak, and he stood up and said, "I'm a cardiologist. I've been a cardiologist for almost 40 years now, and I have never heard one of these things. I think that a few patients are just trying to pull a trick on you. I don't think these things ever happen at all." And then someone else timidly raised his hand and said, "I'm one of his patients, and I still wouldn't tell him." Most of the time we talked to doctors back in those days, we got polite but blank stares back to us. Nurses were different. Nurses are at the bedside. They hear these things. They didn't always believe them, but they heard them. They knew about them. Doctors never heard them and thought it was just totally ridiculous. Now, when we talk at grand rounds at hospitals, the doctors in the audience are eager to tell us their experiences. There is still a lot of debate in medical schools about what these things mean, but there's no debate about they really do happen. Within the general society, it's also become very common. I mean, if Homer Simpson can have one, anyone can have one, right? But third, what tickles me most about NDE research right now, and it is the research that excites me, is the next generation. When I look around to the people that I started doing this work with, I see how old they're all getting. And sometimes that gets discouraging. And coming to a conference like this and seeing the graduate students and the new graduates doing research we wouldn't have even dreamt of doing, and doing it with better tools than we ever had, I'm really encouraged for the future of near-death research. And more importantly, that they're doing it is now we have near-death experiencers going through graduate school and learning how to play the academic game and do respectable science and still be true to the experience. So that gives me tremendous hope that all these questions that we are raising and think are important but can't answer yet will be answered at some point in the future. And that's what tickles me most, that long after we're dead and gone, or at least gone, near-death research will not be. It's going on. I have to respond to what John said before. John has been, for 37 years, really frustrated with the rest of us. He was hoping we'd all be as excited as he is about the vision for transforming this planet, this universe. The difference is that John's vision is out there in the cosmos, and mine is in the trenches. And we just don't have the same passion for the same ways of looking at things. I really appreciate what he's doing, but I can't feel the same optimism that he does for it. He's hoping that if everyone thought the way near-death experiencers did, we wouldn't have wars, we wouldn't have poverty, we wouldn't have competition. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think that what will happen, if we all start thinking like near-death experiencers, is that we're going to get through the wars and the catastrophes and come out better on the other side. I think if you use the NDE that an individual has as a model for what society is going through, our planet may be going through a near-death experience. We can't avoid the catastrophe. There are too many non-experiencers, and in fact, there are too many experiencers who still have catastrophes. But having the NDE mindset helps you get through it, learn from it, and come out better on the other side. And that's where I think the optimism is.
Well, you know, the idea of self-annihilation doesn't really appeal to me. I mean, the idea, the gnashing of teeth scenario, darkness is upon the face of the land, all that stuff, it doesn't have to be that way, and that's what the NDEers told me. And listen, I didn't make this up. This is what they told me, and I believe them. They said with great passion, with tears, with facial countenance that could not be mistaken, that we can learn from these experiences. Not just the NDE, but all manner of spiritually transformative experiences. They all point to the same thing. Oh, and by the way, they happen to have great accordance with the teachings of the ancient mystics and sages. As I say, they're simple truths. I don't need to repeat them. But I applaud what Bruce and his colleagues do in the trenches very much, because the state of the art has moved forward as a result of their labor. Truly, the field is more mature. It is a more respectable subject. And Eben Alexander's book is going to come out maybe next year sometime. That'll move it forward even more, because he's a neurosurgeon who had an NDE and has been transformed by it. So little by little, we keep getting closer and closer. But you know, I am tired of the mental gymnastics. To me, it's fairly obvious, and I look forward to the day when we can get beyond the question. Because as far as I'm concerned, the question's been asked ad nauseum and answered ad nauseum. And I'm not talking about answered by theologians. I'm not talking about accepting it as a matter of faith. I mean, if Fritz Klein comes to an IANDS meeting, not a researcher, he's not an experiencer, I came to the same conclusion in 1974 for the same reason. Well, what makes us so special? I mean, surely there should be more like us out there who see the same things the same way. And I don't think you have to come near death to appreciate what it signifies. So what tickles me is that IANDS is still here. despite all the odds. And I echo what Bruce said in his beautiful presentation this morning, that it's a miracle that IANDS is still standing after 30-odd years, 34, 35 years. And I'm sorry that we're not being broadcast globally to an audience of hundreds of millions. We should be. Everybody who's had a spiritually transformative experience should be in the membership. There shouldn't, this is a vanguard organization. People look to it for leadership, for guidance. It should be visionary. All those who do research and who've written the books should be contributing to it and helping it along. I mean, this was the original strategy. It should be a resource for researchers and experiencers and for the interested public in a major way on a global level. I look forward to the day when most experiencers, not just near-death experiencers, but the broader category of peak experiences, and most researchers are part of this because they are seeing the same things that I saw in 1974. I hope that day happens soon because I think that the world is a very troubled place, and it's getting more so because, frankly, people they suffer from myopia. They don't really understand who they really are and why they're really here. I'm not a religious person. I don't go to church. I don't have any, I don't have any dogma other than what I told you earlier. It's a simple dogma, and it's based on what I think is an empirical foundation. And I think if more people could embrace that, there's hope for the future. I don't know that we're going to necessarily destroy ourselves, but I don't even want to come close to the prospect. The fact that we live with nuclear weapons, the fact that we're now 7 billion people, when in 1945 we were 2.3 billion, the fact that nature is showing all kinds of signs of distress, the fact that we've got these stupid wars going on that shouldn't be fought, the fact that we still have conflict and discord and division among religions when there doesn't even need to be religion, the fact that we have hunger. Right now as we speak, half the population on this planet don't have enough to eat or have nothing to eat. That's not funny if you're one of them. So I think about them, and I apologize for my zealousness. I've had it for 37 years. It won't quit. And I hope that, I say you people are part of the solution because I hope you see the same thing I do. And I hope you will go out and encourage more people to support IANDS so that it can support the folks in the trenches that are doing the good work. And I mean, we could throw $10 billion at NDE research, and I hope we do. But we're not going to learn much more that's new. Certainly those fundamental truths that I espoused earlier won't change. They're going to be the same bottom line is going to be the same bottom line. How many times do you need to hear it? Before you just accept it, integrate it, assimilate it, and get on with the business of serving the greater good. And, the expression, be the change you want to see in the world, I try to live by that. That's my daily religion. I try to do no harm. I try to be the highest vibration and the brightest light I can be. And so I'm part scholar, intellectual, and scientist. I'm part metaphysician, mystic, seer and soothsayer. And I'm part radical, revolutionary, rebellious social change agent that wants to, throw out what we have because it's not working, it's highly dysfunctional, and we need something that's much more equitable for everybody, a world that works for everybody. We don't have that, then we don't have a sustainable future. We can only be as strong as our weakest link. And right now that weak link is pretty weak in my estimation. And with that, I thank you.
One more round of applause for Raymond, Bruce, and John. Fabulous.